Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I can't compete with the cartoon, I fear, but I may have to go just as quickly because we've got a very little time, quite a lot of ground to cover. So this is very much a snapshot. I'm not talking about conservation goals in general. There are many, of course, at different scales. I'm going to be talking simply about Target 11 and the goals that we have arising out of the Conference on Biological Diversity. Before I do that, though, I need to make it very clear that although I'm reporting on what was in the Protected Planet report launched yesterday, the whole report is the result of efforts by a very significant number of people in a wide variety of organizations, and I'd like to thank them all. This, I suspect, you don't need to see, but what I want you to look at here is the color coding, because Aichi Target 11 is not just about area, which is what traditionally we've been talking about. When we're together in South Africa in 2003, we were very much focused on area of coverage. The new target, the new goals, have a whole range of different, if you like, contextual and sometimes even more important objectives. First of all, very briefly, on what are we basing this analysis? The first point I want to make is that since 2003, the last 10 years since the last Congress, the quality of the World Database of Protected Areas has had an amazing change. The simplest measure, it used to contain about 80,000 protected areas, and it's now almost 210,000. And the quality of that information has changed as well. It used to be mostly point data, it's now mostly polygon data. In fact, that was in 2013. The current data set, we're down to only 5% of the data with points, 95% has polygons. So that's the background data which we're using, layered, of course, on top of all other data sets. So what are the results? Well, we're looking for 17% of terrestrial and inland water under protection and 10% of coastal and marine. Today, the actual result is 15.4% of terrestrial areas, and we're up to 8.4% of marine in total. Although the detail is very important because it's around 10.9% of coastal waters, but only a miserable 0.26% on the high seas. The second element in the targets for 2010 for 2020 are that these areas have got to be of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we've looked at, with the help of BirdLife and other partners, we've looked at the coverage of areas like important bird areas and the Alliance for Zero Extinction areas. And what we find is that, in fact, only 23% of the IBAs and 22% of the AZEs are entirely within protected areas. So clearly, in terms of focusing on those areas of particular importance for biodiversity, we have a very long way to go. When it comes to ecosystem services, we have even further to go because we don't even have the basic measures yet. This is a work in progress, and we can come up with figures now like 3.5% of global terrestrial carbon stocks are locked up in humid tropical forests and protected areas, but we have a very long way to go before we can really talk authoritatively about this. Then we move to the fact that these areas are meant to be ecologically representative. Well, we've looked at this in various different ways. Of 823 terrestrial ecoregions, which are broken into a number of realms, biomes, we find that the neotropics is the only realm with 17% coverage. And some of the biomes, particularly temperate grasslands and subtropical dry broadleaf forest, are very, very poorly represented within protected areas. Looking in the marine environments, in this particular study, the world is broken into 232 marine ecoregions, 62 marine provinces, and 12 marine realms. Half of the realms, 39% of the provinces, do meet the 10% target, but that's still a long way from being satisfactory. Next up, looking on the high seas and the pelagic provinces, 37 of those have been identified. It's actually 66% of the total surface area of the Earth, and only a miserable 5% of these meet the 10% target. So there is a real problem, mostly a governance problem, with protected areas on the high seas. Moving on to a consideration of whether these areas are effectively and equitably managed, particularly in this case effectively. Generally speaking, we all tend to look at the management inputs, how much spent per square kilometre, how many staff per square kilometre, those kind of metrics. It doesn't actually tell us know whether the biodiversity values that we're trying to protect are in fact being maintained. Mostly that data is absent. So very, very difficult to get good statistics here. But the one that we have is the number of countries that have actually undertaken protected area management studies on their parks and wildlife in the state. And in 2013, only 45 countries had in fact assessed more than 60% of their protected areas. But I have to say, even that was a surprise to me because I had the impression it was much less. So this is clearly moving in a useful direction. Are they effectively managed from a biodiversity point of view? Well, here we've used the Living Planet Index, a cut of the Living Planet Index, looking at biodiversity populations of animals inside and outside protected areas. Interestingly enough, which it's not interesting, it's pretty very important. The decline of biodiversity inside protected areas is half as rapid as that outside. Mind you, it is still declining. Then these areas are meant to be equitably managed as well. That is really difficult to measure. What we're trying to do here is look at the governance type as some sort of proxy. Even if you know what the governance type is, you still don't know how effectively or equitably it really is being managed. So this is on its way. In order to build up this data, we're going to have to completely reimagine the world database of protected areas and open it up for much better quality data on indigenous and community conserved areas and other sorts of data of this kind, so that we can really look at the governance process. And then finally, the target requires not only to look at protected areas in the formal sense, but also other effective area-based conservation measures. And the problem here is that we hardly even know what that means. There's a whole definitional problem to be resolved before we can make much progress in measuring. And this is a gap which remains quite a serious one in our opinion, but it is something we'll be working on over the next few years. It wasn't finally, this is final. And then all these areas are meant to be integrated into the wider landscape and seascape. Very, very tricky to get any kind of metrics around this. However, there are some possibilities. So, for example, there is now a spatial element in NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, that countries are having to put together as a result of their membership of the Conference on Biological Diversity. So there are a lot of people across the globe working very hard to support countries with this area-based work. And we're hoping that we can capture a lot of what is going on in these NBSAP documents, which has to be lodged with the Secretariat of the Convention. So I think there will be data emerging from these over the next couple of years. So that very much is a snapshot of where we are. And what I do hope is that you don't just remember the area bits at the beginning, because some of that is looking quite good. But as we'll talk over the next 3 days, meeting the area target, I fear, is not going to be enough to achieve what we really want to achieve. Thank you very much.